Molly Corbett and her father, Thomas Martins, will spend more time in prison. A judge in Davidson County sentenced the pair to 4 to 6 years, but they will only serve 7 months to 2 years after getting credit for the 3 years and 8 months that they have already served.
Jason Corbett was born in 1976 in Limerick, Ireland, into a close and traditional family that valued loyalty, routine, and togetherness. He grew up alongside his twin brother Wayne and his sister Tracy in a home remembered by relatives as warm and full of laughter. His upbringing was simple and grounded, the kind of ordinary family life that quietly shapes a person into someone dependable and kind. Jason was known as sociable, hardworking, and easy to get along with. He worked for a packaging company in Ireland and built a steady life for himself. Friends and relatives often described him as someone without ego, someone who valued family more than status or attention. His bond with his sister Tracy was especially close, and those who knew them often said they shared an unusually strong connection. During his adult years, Jason met Margaret Fitzpatrick, known to friends and family as Mags. They met through mutual friends in Limerick and quickly developed a close relationship. People around them believed they suited each other naturally. Jason, who had never been seen as particularly romantic before, seemed completely changed after meeting Mags. Their relationship grew stronger over time, and they eventually married in June 2003. The couple soon started a family together. Their son Jack was born in September 2004, and their daughter Sarah followed in September 2006. By all accounts, their life together was calm and genuinely happy. It was not dramatic or glamorous, but it was full of ordinary moments that seemed stable and meaningful. That peaceful life changed suddenly in November 2006. Mags had suffered from asthma for much of her life, and one evening she became seriously unwell. Family members present at the house noticed she was struggling and trying to use her inhaler. Jason rushed to help her and attempted to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible, but she died on the way there. Her death devastated the entire family. Jason was only 30 years old at the time and suddenly found himself alone with 2 very young children, including a daughter who was only 2 months old. Many people expected grief to overwhelm him completely, but Jason focused all of his energy on raising Jack and Sarah. According to those close to him, he visited Mags's grave constantly, sometimes several times each day. He would bring flowers, cards, and updates about the children. He continued working while also handling the responsibilities of parenthood on his own. Friends and relatives later described him as a devoted father who placed his children above everything else. His life became centered around maintaining stability for them after the loss of their mother. In 2008, Jason decided he needed help caring for the children while managing work and daily responsibilities. He advertised for a live-in au pair and eventually hired Molly Martins, a young woman from Knoxville, Tennessee. She moved to Ireland and began helping with childcare. Over time, the relationship between Jason and Molly became more personal. By 2010, they were engaged, and in 2011, they married in Tennessee before relocating the family to North Carolina in the United States. Jason transferred within the same packaging company and began working in the Winston-Salem area. The family moved into a large house in Walberg, Davidson County, in a quiet golf community. The home had been purchased using money from the sale of Jason's house in Ireland, along with much of his savings. Relocating to another country represented a major change for him. He left behind his familiar surroundings, his extended family, and much of the life he had built in Ireland. From the outside, the Corbett household appeared comfortable and stable. Jason worked while Molly cared for the children, and they lived in an attractive suburban neighborhood. Over time, however, reports later suggested the marriage had become increasingly troubled. Friends and relatives claimed Jason had expressed unhappiness and had spoken about wanting to return to Ireland with the children. According to people close to him, this was not just a passing idea, but something he had seriously considered. Investigators later found evidence suggesting he had been exploring a move back to Limerick not long before his death. These developments would eventually become important during the legal proceedings that followed. On the evening of August 1, 2015, Molly's parents, Thomas and Sharon Martins, arrived at the Corbett home for a visit. The family spent the evening together and later went to bed. During the early hours of August 2, Thomas Martins called emergency services and reported a violent incident involving Jason and Molly.
Davidson County 911, what is the address of your emergency?
My name is Tom Martins. I'm at 160 Panther Creek Court, and we need help.
Okay. What's going on there?
My daughter's husband, my son-in-law, got in a fight with my daughter. I intervened, and I think he's in bad shape. We need help.
Okay, what do you mean he's in bad shape? He's hurt?
He's bleeding all over, and I may have killed him.
Emergency responders arrived at the home within minutes and found a disturbing scene inside the master bedroom. Jason Corbett was lying on the floor with severe injuries. Blood was present throughout the room and surrounding areas. Despite efforts to revive him, he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Authorities quickly began investigating the incident as a homicide. Thomas Martins claimed he had intervened during a violent confrontation between Jason and Molly. According to his account, he believed Molly was in danger and acted to protect her. He stated that he used a baseball bat during the struggle and that Molly had also struck Jason with a paving brick. Investigators examined the scene carefully and began comparing the physical evidence with the statements provided. The injuries to Jason Corbett were extensive. Medical examination later determined he had suffered multiple severe blows to the head. The damage to his skull was so serious that medical experts could not determine the exact number of strikes, although they concluded he had been hit at least 12 times. The brutality of the injuries became one of the central points in the case. Prosecutors argued that the violence exceeded what would be expected in a desperate act of self-defense. Another detail that drew attention during the investigation was the discovery of trazodone in Jason's system. Trazodone is a sedative medication, and evidence later showed Jason had never been prescribed it. Records indicated Molly had received a prescription for the drug only days before the incident. This became an important part of the prosecution's argument, although many details surrounding the presence of the medication remained disputed and heavily debated. Investigators also focused on the behavior of those involved after Jason's death. Authorities noted that neither Molly nor Thomas appeared to have significant physical injuries, despite describing a violent struggle. Questions were also raised about the condition of Jason's body when emergency responders arrived, including observations that his body felt unusually cold. Prosecutors later argued that these details created inconsistencies in the timeline presented by the defense. Additional controversy emerged when it was revealed that the house had been professionally cleaned shortly after the incident. Jason's family in Ireland later expressed shock at the speed with which efforts had been made to remove traces of the event. Further tension developed when discussions arose regarding the handling of Jason's remains and funeral arrangements. His family eventually brought his body back to Ireland, where he was buried beside his first wife, Mags, in Limerick. As the investigation continued, authorities began building a case against Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins. Investigators reviewed forensic evidence, witness statements, and background information about the family. They also examined possible motives. Prosecutors argued that tensions regarding custody of the children and Jason's desire to return to Ireland may have contributed to the events that occurred. In January 2016, both Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins were charged with second-degree murder. The case attracted widespread attention both in the United States and in Ireland. Thomas Martins had previously worked for many years as an FBI agent, a fact that added further public interest to the story. The legal proceedings that followed became highly complex and emotionally charged. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Jason Corbett had been beaten to death in a manner inconsistent with self-defense. They presented forensic evidence related to blood patterns, injury analysis, and the scene inside the bedroom. They also highlighted Jason's plans to potentially return to Ireland with his children and argued this may have created conflict within the household. The defense argued that Molly and Thomas feared for their lives during a violent confrontation. They presented testimony intended to support claims of emotional and physical tension within the marriage. Recordings of arguments between Jason and Molly were introduced, and witnesses described Molly as fearful of Jason's behavior. The defense maintained that Thomas acted to protect his daughter during what he believed was a dangerous situation. The case became even more complicated because of issues involving statements made by Jason's children. During the original proceedings, certain statements from the children were excluded from evidence. Later appeals argued that this exclusion prevented the defense from fully presenting its case. The legal debate over those statements eventually played a major role in overturning the convictions. In August 2017, both Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins were convicted of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to prison terms of between 20 and 25 years. Many observers believed the verdict reflected the severity of Jason's injuries and the strength of the forensic evidence presented by prosecutors. However, the convictions did not remain in place permanently. In 2020, the North Carolina Court of Appeals overturned the convictions, ruling that the exclusion of certain evidence related to the children's statements had unfairly limited the defense. The decision was later upheld by the North Carolina Supreme Court in a narrow ruling. As a result, both defendants were released while awaiting a possible retrial. The possibility of another lengthy trial created uncertainty for everyone involved. Eventually, prosecutors and defense attorneys reached plea agreements. In 2023, Molly Corbett pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter, while Thomas Martins pleaded guilty to the same charge. The original second-degree murder charges were dropped as part of the agreement. The sentencing that followed considered the time both defendants had already spent in prison after the original convictions. Because they had already served several years, the remaining prison time was significantly reduced. By 2024, both Molly Corbett and Thomas Martins had been released from prison, and by 2025, they had completed parole. The case left lasting emotional consequences for many people connected to it. Jason Corbett's family continued to maintain that he had been a loving father and devoted family man whose life ended violently and unfairly. His sister Tracy and her husband David eventually became the legal guardians of Jack and Sarah. The children returned to Ireland and were raised there after the court removed them from Molly's custody. The public reaction to the case remained divided for years. Some people believed the defense's claims of fear and self-protection, while others believed the physical evidence strongly contradicted the idea of self-defense. Media coverage often focused on different aspects of the story, including family conflict, custody disputes, forensic evidence, and the legal arguments surrounding the appeals process. One of the most tragic elements of the case was the effect on the children at the center of it. Jack and Sarah lost both parents under traumatic circumstances, first their mother during infancy, and later their father in a violent incident that became the subject of international attention. Over time, they spoke publicly about the emotional toll the case had taken on their lives and the years of therapy and adjustment that followed. Jason Corbett's story continued to resonate strongly in Ireland, particularly in Limerick, where he had grown up and built his early life. Many people there remembered him not as a figure from a courtroom drama, but as a hardworking father who endured enormous personal loss after Mags died and who tried to rebuild a stable life for his children. The legal outcome of the case remained controversial because of the difference between the original murder convictions and the later voluntary manslaughter pleas. Some observers viewed the plea agreements as a practical resolution to a complicated legal situation, while others felt justice had not fully been served, considering the severity of Jason's injuries. The investigation and trial also highlighted the importance of forensic interpretation in criminal cases. Experts analyzed blood patterns, injury trajectories, body temperature observations, and other physical evidence in an attempt to reconstruct what had happened inside the bedroom. Different interpretations of those details played a major role in shaping both the prosecution and defense narratives. The emotional testimony presented throughout the proceedings demonstrated how differently the same events could be understood depending on perspective. Supporters of Molly and Thomas described fear, panic, and desperation. Supporters of Jason focused on the brutality of the attack, the inconsistencies in the explanations provided, and Jason's reputation as a caring father. Years after the incident, the case continued to be discussed in documentaries, interviews, and news coverage because it combined elements of family tragedy, international legal conflict, and disputed interpretations of violence within a marriage. The public remained fascinated by unanswered questions surrounding what truly happened during the early hours of August 2, 2015. At the center of the story, however, remained the life of Jason Corbett himself. Friends and family consistently described him as deeply devoted to his children. After losing Mags, he dedicated himself to maintaining normality for Jack and Sarah despite his own grief. He worked steadily, cared for his family, and attempted to build a new future in another country. People close to Jason often reflected on the contrast between the quiet, ordinary life he had once lived in Limerick and the international attention that followed his death. Before the tragedy, he had simply been known as a friendly and dependable man, raising 2 children after devastating personal loss. The violence of his death transformed his story into a prolonged, legal and media battle that stretched across years and continents. The Corbett family in Ireland continued speaking publicly about Jason long after the legal proceedings ended. They emphasized memories of his kindness, his commitment to fatherhood, and his enduring connection to his late wife Mags. Jason was ultimately buried beside her in Limerick, a detail that carried strong emotional significance for many who followed the case. The broader story also reflected how complicated criminal investigations can become when family relationships, emotional trauma, and conflicting narratives are involved. The legal system was forced to weigh forensic evidence against personal testimony, emotional claims against physical facts, and procedural fairness against public perceptions of justice. Even after the final plea agreements and release of the defendants, debates surrounding the case did not disappear. Some believed the reduced charges reflected weaknesses in the prosecution's ability to secure another murder conviction after the appeals ruling. Others believed the original verdict had accurately reflected the seriousness of the crime. The case became an example of how appeals courts can dramatically reshape the outcome of criminal proceedings. Throughout the years of legal arguments and media attention, Jason Corbett's children gradually grew older and built their lives away from the intense spotlight that had surrounded their father's death. Their return to Ireland allowed them to reconnect with extended family and with the place where their early childhood memories had begun. The story remained deeply emotional because it involved repeated experiences of loss. Jason first lost his wife unexpectedly, and then later lost his own life in circumstances that divided families, generated international headlines, and left lasting emotional scars on everyone involved. The people closest to him often described the entire sequence of events as almost impossible to comprehend. Many observers also noted the contrast between Jason's reputation before his death and the allegations presented during the trial. The defense portrayed a troubled and intimidating side of the marriage, while Jason's family and friends strongly rejected that portrayal. These conflicting versions of his character became one of the most disputed elements of the case. The legal arguments surrounding self-defense were especially important because the entire outcome depended on whether the force used could reasonably be viewed as necessary protection or as excessive violence. Jurors, judges, lawyers, and appeal courts all examined this issue repeatedly over the course of many years. Media coverage often focused heavily on dramatic courtroom moments, but beneath those headlines was a deeply personal tragedy involving children, extended families, and irreversible loss. The emotional impact extended far beyond the courtroom itself and continued long after the legal process ended. Jason Corbett's life story, from his upbringing in Ireland to his years as a widowed father and eventually to the circumstances surrounding his death, remained at the heart of public interest in the case. Many people who followed the story viewed him primarily as a father who had endured major hardships while trying to provide stability for his children. The years of legal proceedings eventually came to an end, but the emotional and moral questions surrounding the case continued to linger. Different people drew different conclusions from the same evidence, testimony, and legal outcomes. Some focused on the appeals ruling and procedural fairness, while others focused on the physical evidence and severity of Jason's injuries. Despite the complexity of the legal history, one fact remained unchanged throughout every stage of the case. Jason Corbett lost his life violently inside the home he had built for his family. The consequences of that night reshaped the lives of everyone connected to him, including his children, relatives, and the families on both sides of the conflict. In the years since, Jason's memory has continued to be preserved most strongly by those who knew him personally before the case became internationally known. Friends and relatives remembered him not through courtroom arguments or media debates, but through ordinary moments from his life in Limerick, his years as a father, and his efforts to rebuild after the death of Mags. The story ultimately became more than just a criminal case. It evolved into a complicated narrative about grief, family conflict, loyalty, trauma, and the long reach of legal decisions. The combination of emotional testimony, forensic evidence, and conflicting perspectives ensured that the case would remain widely discussed long after the final court rulings. For Jason Corbett's family, however, the issue was always personal rather than symbolic. To them, he was not simply the subject of legal analysis or public fascination. He was a brother, father, husband, and son whose absence permanently changed the lives of the people who loved him. That reality remained constant, regardless of how the courts interpreted the events surrounding his death. The legacy of the case continues to provoke discussion because it raises difficult questions about justice, truth, and the limits of certainty in criminal investigations. Different interpretations of the same night produced dramatically different legal outcomes over time, yet beneath every argument and appeal remained the undeniable human tragedy of a family shattered by violence. In the end, Jason Corbett was laid to rest in Limerick beside his first wife, the woman whose death had once changed the course of his life years earlier. For many who followed the story, That final detail carried a sense of emotional closure in an otherwise painful and deeply divisive case. Human beings build entire international legal battles around grief, fear, memory, and conflicting stories, then spend years arguing over fragments of truth, while children grow up in the middle of it all. Grim little species, honestly. Still, beneath all the courtroom strategy and media noise, the story remained about a man whose life ended violently and whose children were left to carry the consequences for the rest of their lives.